the digital age, which is actually a really critical perspective on the right, normatively, but also in application. And it's one that hasn't been well developed. So, Kebene, please take it away. You have 20-25 minutes, more, and then we will open it up for questions, discussion, commentary. So do you need to
Yes.
be made, do you need to be made co-user?
No, I think it's okay since I will not be sharing slides.
Okay.
So this works well. So I hope you hear me well. All right. Yeah. So, well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending wherever you are. So it's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much, Bethany, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join this community of scholars and practitioners and thinkers to reflect on what seems to be quite old rights, but suddenly now acquiring huge significance and urgency, particularly the right to freedom of thought in the digital age. So, as I proceed to my presentation today, maybe as an entry point, something that I was kind of like thinking along is like when we think about freedom of thought, we often, at least I used to tend to imagine this is something quite private, right? A kind of an inner sanctuary belonging solely to the individual. It's often treated as a self-evident, sometimes abstract, absolute, and therefore rarely contested space. But the digital environment and the data-driven engagement that we have in our everyday practice seems to unsettle that in a very significant way. Our thoughts, preference, and even our moods are now continuously inferred, nudged, and manipulated by technologies that we engage with on everyday basis. So the central question that motivated the chapter that I contributed to the Cambridge Handbook of Freedom of Thought, edited by Patrick and Bethany, which I really also get a good opportunity to learn from others' work, with part of that collection, grapples with, and I hope to share that with you all today, is what does freedom of thought mean when thought itself is socially, relationally, but also technologically mediated? And more specifically, my question was, how can we then realize the societal dimension of this right beyond considering this just as an individual entitlement or an individual claim? So I'll begin by briefly framing or alluding into the conceptual shift that I hope to bring through this chapter and also today as we during our discussion and also throughout my talk. And then I'll move to the four attributes of the right to freedom of thought that were identified by the special rapporteur, particularly focusing on their societal dimension. And towards the end, I hope we'll be able to show some of a way forward in terms of how can we then translate this into something practical, particularly through strategic litigation and legal mobilization and policy impact. So let me start by somehow recalling what we are all in this network are familiar with. Freedom of thought has been the central part and recognized by almost all major human rights instruments, starting from the UDHR, ICCPR, Article 18, or in the European context, Article 9 of the European Convention, Article 10 of the EU Charter, right? And traditionally, this right has been considered as an individual right against interference and as a shield between the person, the individual, and the state. Yet, if we pause a little bit on the very word thought itself, what does actually thought mean? The debate around that concept can be sometimes simplistic, sometimes abstract, but it really depending from which perspective we look at it, it can also vary. For example, in a relatively narrow and legalistic way of thinking, or in a legal sense, we usually distinguish between manifested and unmanifested thoughts. Unmanifested thought being the forum internum, or what happens in the inner space of our mind, our brain, which is absolutely protected, at least in the context of the European context. And then the manifested thought goes into this domain of expression, which becomes subject to different qualifications and limitations, because now it's not anymore protected, absolutely protected thought, rather it's an expression. But now, when we move a little bit from the legal to the philosophical and psychological perspective of the concept, we can also say a different story about thought. These scholars do remind us that there is actually a perpetual feedback loop between thought and expression. What we think is always shaped by what we engage with, what we see, hear, discuss, encounter in the world. In this sense, thought is not an isolated private spark. Rather, it is an interactive process, continuously formed and reformed, configured, reconfigured in a loop of relationship with others and with our environment surrounding us. So when I speak, at least in this context, about societal dimension of freedom of thought, this is primarily about recognizing the protection of the inner forum, the protection of the forum internum, the individual mental space alone is not sufficient. Rather, we must also protect the external condition, the societal, informational, technological environment within which we all are embedded in, that allows thought to flourish freely. So this is crucial, particularly I would argue in today's digitally mediated environment, which is not no longer more a neutral background of freedom of thought debate. It's more a space where our thoughts are structured through and with algorithms, data profiling, targeted messaging, and neural technology, if we like. And when the environment is distorted and coercive, it undermines not just the individual autonomy and freedom of thought as an individual entitlement, but also the collective capacity to critically reflect, which is the lifeblood for democratic society and for critical thinking. Thus, I would argue here that the right to freedom of thought should be understood not merely as a private liberty, but also as a public and societal and collective good that needs to be protected and nurtured, which is essential for formation, emergence, and protection of reflective, self-determined, and pluralistic society. Now, with this, I'll go through the different the four attributes. So the special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief has identified four attributes of freedom of thought. Three of them being more negative obligations that prohibit on revealing, punishing, and manipulating thoughts, and the fourth one being more positive, a state duty to create a permissive and enabling environment to protect this right and freedom. So my argument here is each of these attributes do have both the individual and societal dimensions. And I'll go through each of them one by one, particularly focusing on the societal dimension. So the first, the right not to reveal our thought, at its very simplest, this is the right to mental privacy. And most scholars to argue along that line. And this is the right not to be compelled to disclose our inner belief, intentions, or emotions, or our thought process. In the digital context, however, this triggers different issues, for example, around consent. And it also brings the question, to what extent are we able to protect ourselves in today's digitally mediated space? For example, our clicks, pauses, scrolling patterns, content we pause on, they are mined to reconstruct what we're likely to think, to feel, to choose. Or in the context of neural technology, this can even be a way in which our brain activity is monitored to detect, for example, guilty knowledge or emotional state. Now, I can go on with the list. Particularly, this is even great with the advent of large language models, right, chatbots and things like that. But at the very core, there are several questions that can arise. For me, one interesting question is then, can consent ever legitimize access to one's mental activity in this context? In some contexts, and some would argue perhaps maybe yes, but practically speaking, meaningful consent is nearly impossible when users face an opaque system that in which one cannot realistically have the option to opt in or opt out. The societal dimension here is often overlooked, though. Imagine if citizens come to believe that there is no longer a space for mental privacy, and with this feeling of being in this panopticon Orwellian state, then this comes with this consequence of self-censorship, self-control, not only in the context of speech, but also in the context of thought itself. So it has a significant chilling effect, and the chilling effect produces what I've also discussed in the chapter as the emergence of conformist society, where reflective and independent thought process might become or considered as a risky business. So protecting the right not to reveal one's thought therefore safeguards not only the individual, but the collective capacity for self-examination, for critical thinking and dissent. When I proceed to the second one, the right not to be punished for one's thought, the idea that one cannot be punished for one's own mere thought may sound quite obvious, but in the context of data-driven technology, that can really get complicated. For example, behavioral analytics, social credit system, or algorithmic risk scoring can penalize individuals for inferred intentions or attitudes, or for one's moral reliability or trustworthiness. In effect, this collapses the boundary between thought and action because now what is inferred is taken as a basis to punish or reward an individual with societal level consequence. Punishing thought, even in those perceived form, corrodes democratic life. It encourages thought policing, both by public actors, state, as well as by individual actors, private actors, corporations. Now, more concretely, if we imagine large-scale surveillance programs that flag, for example, potentially harmful thoughts or radicalized thoughts based on online patterns or social credit system that reward or penalize citizens for their perceived moral reliability and trustworthiness. When punishment is based on inferred cognition rather than real-time practical conduct, this has an impact on entire community as leading to an extent of stigmatizing, for example, a specific category or a specific group in a community or in a society. So it has a far-reaching societal consequences, and it produces fear, conformity, and silence. And those fears rarely fall on everyone on equal distribution, if I may put it that way. So it exacerbates, for example, existing inequality, targeting of people based on protected identities, whether social, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, or religious identity, as well as distant groups. So then when I come to the third one, then the right not to have our thoughts manipulated, this attribute lies at the very heart of today's challenge and also debates, because it's about manipulation, right? Manipulation of thought no longer requires overt coercion as it used to be. It operates through design and persuasion in a very subtle way and often beneath the threshold of this considered as awareness label. Think of personalized feeds, targeted political advertisement, or dark patterns that steer users towards a particular choice, or as studies have extensively shown, for example, altering an order of a search may result in swaying voters' decision, or psychologically tailored content can have a significant shift and impact on people opinion and mood. So we saw, for example, a tragic consequence of such manipulation and more recently in the context of large language models, but also a bit earlier in the context of social media platforms to an extent of inflaming ethnic and religious hatred, leading to mass violence and the falling apart of the societal fabric and societal legal harmony. What is at stake in all this is then it's not simply about the individual harm that is experienced, even though that's quite important, it's also the societal dimension of and impact of these technologies. So the erosion of, for example, the shared informational environment that makes collective deliberation possible is continuously being eroded and falling apart. When the entire publics are subjected to algorithmic manipulation, freedom of thought is violated, not just at an individual level, rather at a collective level. Of course, more recently, there are legal frameworks that tend to kind of respond to this challenge. For example, the EU Digital Services Act, as well as the EUI Act, do have provisions that address, for example, certain manipulative design or a ban on subliminal techniques that distort behaviors. While this is an important progress, still all these instruments somehow hinge on proving the individual harm, for example, whereas especially if we think this at the societal level, the true harm is more diffused, it is accumulated in at the societal level. So it's important to question more along to what extent can this instrument also helps us to address not only the individual dimension, but also the societal dimension of freedom of thought. Now, with this, I'll quickly proceed to the fourth attribute, which is the state duty or obligation to provide an enabling environment for the thriving of freedom of thought. This stems basically from the broader human rights duty of a state to protect, respect, and fulfill fundamental rights and freedom, including protection against third-party interference, such as corporations. So it means ensuring that citizens have access to accurate information, robust education, as well as digital ecosystem that support autonomy of thought and thought process. And more concretely, this can be translated, for example, in the context of introducing legislation that regulates high-risk technologies, enforcement of transparency obligations on platform, for example, or investing on digital literacy and granting access to remedies where this right is violated. So at a very important level, then this is also about remembering that freedom of thought does not flourish in isolation, whether this is in the negative or positive duty context. It depends on the environment of trust, diversity, and openness. When that environment is polluted by surveillance, disinformation, manipulation, then the state has failed in delivering on its duty to positively provide enabling environment. So then the next question is then, okay, how do we translate this societal dimension into more something practical, something implementable? And in the chapter, I tried to look at the strategic litigation as one alternative, but the notion of strategic litigation I use here is not only limited into courtroom victories and performance, if I may put it that way, rather it's more about using the legal action or test case, if you like, to clarify laws, doctrines, reinterpret, expand them, and shift public narrative and create more institutional and policy change through these avenues. So for this, I identified three avenues. The first one is data protection, particularly under the GDPR, for example. Article 80 allows not-for-profit institutions such as consumer protection groups or trade union and civil society organizations to act on behalf of data subjects. And the provision can be leveraged, I would argue, to frame data-driven profiling, surveillance, or manipulative designs as a violation of both an individual privacy and data, as well as a freedom of thought. We have already seen a positive progress in this direction. For example, in the Netherlands, System Risk Indicator case struck down the automated welfare fraud detection system. So a lesson that can be learned from this experience is my argument. So by building class action around intrusive data practice, we can begin to litigate the societal scale or the societal dimension of harm of mental interference even before explicit freedom of thought and jurisprudence matures to the level that we want it to be. The second avenue is that it involves product liability, holding platforms accountable, not as content publishers, rather as product designers whose design choice cause a specific harm. And this is somehow gaining significance, particularly in the US, for example, against large language chatbots, large language models, but also against platform companies, TikTok, Meta, and Snap. Um, and also to an extent in Europe, I would say. So the main argument here is plaintiffs would argue that the design of this platform, their recommendation algorithm, and attention extractive model or business design constitute a defective product causing a mental and emotional harm, particularly against the young. So although these cases are often come as a negligence in consumer safety, they implicitly address, I would argue, the manipulation of thought and behavior, and they could evolve into more powerful mechanism to protect mental integrity and the collective right to healthy cognitive environments. The third avenue is the right to privacy litigation, particularly when it is grounded in a broader interpretation of private life. For example, using Article 8 of the European Convention, there are several cases, starting with the Big Brother's case. An experience does shows us, and there is a court jurisprudence that indicate there is a positive willingness and openness from the court side to kind of broadly interpret the right to privacy to cover different surveillance and mass surveillance dimension of this without the need to prove, for example, an individual harm, which is important in terms of burden of proof and things like that. So the open this opens the door for public interest litigation as well as in abstractional claims that challenge the chilling effect of surveillance and manipulation and in mental privacy, not only at individual but at larger societal scale, and also can have a significant policy implication and regulatory implication, I would argue. Now, to conclude, let me step back and summarize the bigger picture of what I wanted to kind of like emerge from the chapter and also from what I present today. So the right to freedom of thought, long neglected because it seemed absolute, abstract, or more private, has now certainly emerged as a cornerstone right in the digital era. It it yet its importance is significantly still understood in the individual context as an entitlement of the individual. Whereas my argument is yes, while it's individual, there is also a significant societal dimension to it, which is essential for sustaining collective capacity for reasoning, disagreement, agreement, debate, and democratic decision making. Realizing this right, therefore, requires at least dual strategies, what I alluded to. The first is a conceptual clarity and a little bit of conceptual shift, understanding thought as a relational process that is shaped by environment around us rather than just an individual confine of interval or inner space of an individual. And second, practically being innovative to translate this into practice using strategic litigation to translate that insight into enforceable claim or entitlement. So through class action, public interest claim, and also creative use of data protection and product liability regime, we can begin to craft a jurisprudence that recognizes freedom of thought as both an individual entitlement but also as a collective right. Ultimately, the goal here is not to simply prevent intrusion into the mind of an individual, even though that's very crucial, but it is to nurture the condition in which thought itself, whether reflective, critical, conformist, or diverse, or anything, but where thought itself can thrive. Because only then, when society protects the freedom to think together, can a society ought to govern themselves really. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.